species survival in the Anthropocene. Thus, in this series, we both look back into the past and look ahead as we examine critical issues for tiger conservation through the varied lenses of history, science, policy, and practice. In the first session of the Tiger Dialogues, about a month ago, we were joined by historians, administrators, and forest managers who spoke about how colonial attitudes and ambitions brought India's wild tigers to the brink. They also elucidated the remarkable role that individuals and institutions played in steering the species away from extinction over the past 5 decades. While India has come a long way in conserving its national animal, there are daunting challenges when one looks ahead. India's human population has grown by more than 200% since the 1960s. And unsurprisingly, the landscapes that tigers now need to negotiate and increasingly share space with humans in are highly fragmented and vastly modified. If we look around us, it is all too evident that these landscapes continue to be altered, often irreversibly and at an unprecedented rate. Today's session, Bridging Fractured Geographies, Fragmentation, Connectivity, and the Future of India's Wild Tigers, critically examines the issues of habitat connectivity for tigers. Recent studies have unambiguously established that without functional corridors, tigers face many dire risks, including extinction. In today's discussion, we are joined by biologists and corridor champions who have done groundbreaking research to establish the consequences of habitat fragmentation on tigers and other wildlife, and have spared no effort to prevail on courts and agencies and to bring together diverse stakeholders to mitigate habitat fragmentation in these fast-changing landscapes. Today's session is to deliberate about what can still be done to secure corridors for tigers and other wildlife in India before it is too late. It is my honor to introduce the session's moderator, Dr. Dipankar Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a conservation manager with over 25 years of experience in this area. He is currently the director and head of department of the Wildlife and Habitats program at WWF-India, based out of Delhi. This is the largest program of WWF-India, spread across 15 states and 2 union territories, with a team strength of approximately 200 conservation professionals, working closely with state governments, the central government ministries, local communities, and other stakeholders. This program has a special focus on 6 species of high conservation interest: tigers, elephants, rhinoceros, red pandas, Nilgiri tahr, and snow leopards, and the habitats in India. With that, I'll hand over to Dr. Ghosh to introduce our excellent panel for today and to take the session forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pranav, and namaskar, everyone. It's my privilege and an honor to be on this panel discussion during the year of the tiger and the second session of Tiger Dialogues. We have been joined by a group of conservationists, managers, and all of them inspire, at least they inspire me and some of my team members in different aspects. So let me first introduce one of our panelists from overseas, Dr. Gary Tabor. Dr. Tabor is the executive director of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and he's also a senior fellow with the University of Montana Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. Dr. Tabor has worked on behalf of protected areas, wildland conservation, and ecological health in North America for around 30 years, and with 15 years as leader with the US Environmental Philanthropic Community. Gary recently completed 6 years of service on the Board of Governors of Society for Conservation Biology. He also serves on the US boards of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and Australian Bush Heritage. But what is most important for today is Gary's unending enthusiasm and his push for all of us as a chair of IUCN WCPA Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group. And he also has a great quality and a skill to connect with people. Connectivity needs connections with people and people connecting with each other across continents. So welcome, Gary. Thank you so much for agreeing to wake up very early and join the session. Our next panelist, another inspiring scientist, Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan, is an Indian molecular ecologist and professor at the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore. Uma did a Bachelor of Science in Physics, Chemistry, and Mathematics, and a Master's in Biotechnology, and subsequently she received a PhD from the University of California. After that, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. Her research investigates population genetics and the evolutionary history of mammals in the Indian subcontinent, including her work to save India's tigers. Uma's work on the connectivity of tiger populations in central India was present in the quote to stay the widening of one of the highways which cuts across the Kanha-Pench corridor. Welcome, Uma, and thank you for joining. Our third panelist today is Dr. Divya Vasudev, who is a visiting faculty at the Ashoka University. She obtained her master's in wildlife biology and conservation from the multi-institutional postgraduate program of Manipal Academy and Wildlife Conservation Society Center for Wildlife Studies in 2006. After that, she went to obtain her doctoral degree in wildlife ecology and conservation from the University of Florida. And she was a senior scientist at Wildlife Conservation Society India program. And currently, she functions as an independent person as well as one of the chief scientists with conservation initiatives. And welcome, Divya. This is probably one of the very few times when I'm seeing you in a room. Mostly we're in the field and or we meet in some serious discussions in workshops. Thank you for joining. And the fourth panelist today is Mr. Milind Parivakkam, who is again mostly not inside a room or within four walls. He's a field person, and Milind is a wildlife biologist and conservationist with about 16 years of experience in setting up and running conservation program. He has worked for two large conservation NGOs in the country, Wildlife Trust of India and the Wildlife Conservation Trust previously. His current work focuses on policy aspects of mitigating the threats of linear infrastructure on wildlife habitats, and especially in the central Indian landscape context. Among his key achievements are India's first and world's longest mitigation measures for wildlife along the National Highway 7 in the Kanha-Pench corridor, and we'll hear more about it from Milind. So let's start the discussion, and one kind of an ideal situation, what we want to do on this particular webinar is let's have it more interactive, and I would request all the viewers to post their questions on the chat, and with the backend support from the excellent team of 3 organizations, I will try and pick up questions and put them to the panelists. We all know that connectivity is critical for any large mammal landscape, and the same is true for tiger landscapes in India or in other tiger range countries. We have also seen that habitat fragmentation in the subcontinent has led to the disruption of natural evolutionary process of wild tigers. Especially, the evidence is more stark in some of the subgroups of Bengal tiger, particularly in central and North India, Northeast, and some parts of Northwest India. So my first question today will be to Dr. Gary Tabor. Gary, you head an organization that focuses on large landscapes and connectivity. I have a simple question. Why do corridors matter?
Well, as I answer your question, I want to say that, tigers are a charismatic species, but I want to say thank you to the organizers for having me here and for joining other charismatic individuals in participating in this Tiger Alive initiative. So corridors matter. Well, let me, if you will, Dipankar, I'd just like to show 4 slides that kind of represent the issue. So I'm going to share my screen. And the first test of connectivity is, will this work in a remote fashion? So hold on for 1 second. And do you see my my slides here? And let me start the PowerPoint. Hold on. Do you see the first slide? Thank you. Well, why does connectivity matter? Well, we know that the biggest threat to terrestrial biodiversity, and increasingly folks in the marine world are seeing this too, is that fragmentation is probably the #1 threat. Of course, climate change is exacerbating that threat. And when you think of fragmentation, you have to think of linear infrastructure. And over the next 25 years, every road, every rail, every canal, every pipeline, transmission line will double. Everything you know now will double in the next 25 years. And in fact, in Asia, across 28 countries in Asia, we did an assessment. Most of the new infrastructure, 2/3 of it, will be new footprint. It's going to go in the wildest part of Asia. And the world now is already chopped up into 600,000 bits. You can measure the bits. Even Canada, you know, wild Canada, just north of where I am right now, is facing this threat of fragmentation. And we want these services, but we also have to figure out how to live with these services in a more ecological ways. And all species on the planet are so impacted by this fragmentation, they can't even complete their life cycles. There's no room to roam. They can't find forage, they can't find mates, they can't disperse with seasons. So it's a major problem around the world. And a lot of people forget that there are direct impacts, disturbances with linear infrastructure. In fact, there are over, and we estimate, and this is a low figure, 100 million large mammals are killed in wildlife vehicle collisions every year. You know it in India. In Tasmania and Australia, 400 to 500 Tasmanian devils are killed every year on roadside collisions. The direct impact of roads, rails, and other linear infrastructure on direct mortality wildlife is so underestimated that I believe we do not even have a handle on the size of the problem. Of course, folks who look at birds and bats realize that billions of individuals are killed by hitting transmission lines and windmills and so forth. And we have to figure out a way for animals to move as we need the services to sustain the transportation that feeds our economies. India is the home to the largest population of wild tigers. Connectivity matters. We know now that tigers need to move. Well, we always know that tigers need to move, but we know more than ever that protected areas alone aren't going to save tigers. The protected areas provide safe and secure core habitat, but tigers need to roam, to connect with each other, to sustain their livelihoods over time. Here in the United States, sadly, we have more tigers in cages. All our tigers are in cages. And we have 5,000 of them. Some people say that the most tigers in the world are in the United States, and that's absurd. So we're talking here about connectivity, not cages. To be a tiger, you also have to live like a tiger and live in the context, both ecologically and culturally, that's so important for the survival of the species. The world has become so fragmented that you look on every continent and you see there are amazing efforts to reconnect the fragments that are out there, to essentially re-wild nature, heal nature from the fragmentation. So connectivity is important because it is the way that we connect protected areas, areas of high biodiversity, to maintain the ecology of a region. And whether you look at Florida, where they're trying to protect the landscape for the panther, or Yellowstone to Yukon, where they're trying to connect the landscape for grizzly bears, or in Albertine Rift, where it's for elephants and gorillas, But I just want to also point out that it's more than just species. And I'm just going to point to the Great Eastern Ranges of Australia, because as we know, both in India and around the world, we're seeing more extreme weather events, big floods, big fires, big extreme weather, big droughts. And we need these connected landscapes, not only for the species that move about, but because it buffers these impacts of climate change that really impact the life of everybody. And so connectivity matters because it's not just good for the individual species, but it's also good for us. And now let me stop sharing my screen and come back. So I hope that you kind of get a sense visually that I want to say that connectivity and corridors are important to Panker, not just because they're critical for tigers, because they are, but in some ways, tigers are a mirror to us. If tigers can connect and move and maintain themselves, so do we. And that's why connectivity is so important.
Thank you, Gary. You also gave a starting figure of the number of animals which get killed on the highways and on roads. What we also at times do not notice are the unseen challenges of avoidance. If construction of a particular infrastructure, even if it's a mitigation measure, takes a longer time, then animals start avoiding that stretch, and perhaps that will have long-term consequences. Let me go to Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan. Uma, what have been the findings of some of your recent research, which you are doing with your team in connectivity conservation, and particularly with reference to India's national animal, the tiger?
Thanks so much, Dipankar, and thank you all for this invitation. It's really an honor to be here with all of you today. So I'm a scientist, and I think that we all want to avoid extinction of species. In this case, we're talking about tigers. And we know from decades of research in ecology and evolution that small populations have high chances of extinction. In fact, populations which are smaller than 100 individuals, it's almost like some kind of a threshold. There's a lot that's been written about this, have quite a high chance of extinction. Now, if you look at tigers in India's protected areas, there's very few populations that have more than 100 tigers, maybe 4 or 5. And so for tigers to survive, it's almost a no-brainer that they must exist in landscapes which encompass or allow for larger populations than 100 individuals, right? So this seemed like an important thing to understand. And I'm a molecular ecologist, as you said. I use genetics. We use genetics, all my young colleagues, my students, postdocs, and I, to understand what's happening in wild populations. So it turns out that if you have connectivity, if you have animals moving between two populations, imagine 2 cans of paint which are mixing. So using DNA, using genetic samples from these 2 locations, you could understand how distinct or mixed these populations are. So our first goal was to understand what are genetic landscapes or groups of tigers which stick together as a genetic unit. And this was really revealing because we really had no idea. And it told us, for example, that tigers in central India generally appear to be connected to each other. We then asked, why are there specific land use types? Gary brought up roads, linear barriers, infrastructure. What parts of the landscape affect tigers in terms of their ability to mix more than do others? Realize there's a correlation. We are assuming that genetic mixing is the true signature of gene flow or movement, and we are mapping land use types or landscapes to those data to understand or attribute potential resistance or ability to facilitate gene flow. And these data showed us, these data analyses, landscape genetic analyses suggested that high traffic roads and high density human settlements have disproportionately negative impacts on connectivity. So that was a journey we were on a few years ago. And then, of course, as a geneticist, I always wondered what happens to populations which are isolated. Does anything happen to them? Of course, theoretically, they're more prone to extinction, but do we see effects of small population size? And already in the context of Indian tigers, we've studied two such populations. One is Ranthambore Tiger Reserve in Rajasthan, where our data suggests strong signatures of inbreeding. Tigers here are twice as inbred as tigers anywhere else. And also Simlipal Tiger Reserve, where by chance, a specific phenotype, a look, these black tigers have increased in frequency and they're not found anywhere else. So these chance effects and inbreeding effects, these are purely genetic effects, are already showing in tigers. You think of evolution, for SARS-CoV-2 or bacteria, viruses, but seeing it in real time for tigers is really striking. So that goes back, this may sound theoretical, but it goes back to the original discussion that we must maintain connectivity. Definitely certain land use types, developments and so on negatively impact connectivity, and lack of connectivity does impact individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ima. At the very beginning, you, I think, answered almost what Gary said, that we need to avoid extinction, and connectivity is also important. You have also touched upon a very interesting point on genetic mutation and what's happening with tigers. We'll come to that in slightly more depth. Let me go to Divya. Divya, connectivity conservation has come a long way in the last 4 decades or so. We are also starting to understand that corridors are not just linear strips of forests between protected areas or habitat patches. There is better understanding, and as Uma was also saying, some groundbreaking research has also happened in the corridors. So as a young scientist, and you also communicate a lot among the contemporary researchers, what is the definition, or rather well-accepted definition nowadays, of a biological corridor?
Thanks, Deepankar. It's a really interesting discussion, and it's extremely interesting to me as a landscape ecologist. With my team at Conservation Initiatives, we do a lot of work on landscape scale conservation, especially in Northeast India, because we think that that is the way to go. And I think that also speaks to your question. Traditionally, our notion of connectivity, or how patches of forests were connected, were via these narrow corridors or narrow forested links between different forest patches. Under that sort of thought process, one would think that if a tiger had to go from point A to point B, it would find only a complete forest route to get from point A to point B. And hence the definition of forested corridors or habitat corridors, and hence the focus on protecting these corridors. What we have come to realize and incorporate into our understanding of connectivity now is that while these forested corridors are extremely important, tigers and other animals also move through other areas. They move through croplands, they move through plantation lands. There are even examples, there were photos, for instance, of elephants moving through Tezpur town to get from one forest to another. And of course, the animals don't have the same propensity to move through these different areas differently. And a lot of the work that we do focuses on that. It's to understand not just where the animals are moving, which would allow us to answer the question, where do we place our corridors? But it's also to understand the question of why do animals move in some places and not move in others. So you can imagine that the propensity of a tiger to move through an open paddy field is going to be very different from its propensity to move through shade-grown coffee, which has a lot of undergrowth as well as a lot of shade trees, which is going to be different from its propensity to move through a reserve forest, for instance, which has some amount of prey, which has lower human footprint. Like Uma said, a human footprint does play a very major role in where animals move and where they don't. So there is a difference in how probable it is for a tiger to move, or any other wildlife to move, through these different land uses. And one big factor in this is really both human presence and human response to these dispersals. And that's where connectivity, I think, also becomes really interesting, because it directly takes us to the realm of human-wildlife interactions. A disperser has to move from a forest to another forest, often through human-use lands. It brings them directly in the realm of contact, or in the contact zone of people. So I'd like to show you a short, just a clip, to kind of demonstrate how people's responses to an animal, and this is not a clip of tigers, it's a clip of elephants, which is what our work mainly focuses on. But it's a short clip that demonstrates how people's responses to, over here, elephants, can drastically change the way in which they perceive the landscape. So let me just share my screen. I hope you can all see that. And as you can see in this first little bit, let me just let it play. So that first bit was an example of elephants moving through tea garden, which is not a forested corridor, but a plantation land that they use a lot for connectivity. But you can see that people's responses to elephants when they are in these plantation lands can obviously drastically change the way in which they move, and it can drastically shape human-wildlife interactions. It can also, which can have ramifications and negative consequences for both people and for wildlife. Now, the second part of this clip is still elephants moving through tea plantations. Granted, this particular patch of the plantation doesn't actually have tea, but it's still through tea plantations. And you can see the difference in the animal's behavior, as well as in the way in which it's moving. There's a huge contrast. And so a lot of our work now is to look, sorry. And this, of course, is also from landscapes where we work. And it is an extreme sort of situation where human presence is clearly going to influence the way that animals move. Stop sharing. So I just wanted to show that as a contrast in terms of how people's responses can really drastically change the way that the propensity of animals to use these non-forested lands as compared to forested lands. And animals have been using plantations and croplands in the past to connect from one forest to another. And human-wildlife interactions in these areas are critical to ensure that animals are able to continue moving through these croplands. So I think it's really important for our policy in terms of connectivity conservation to consider both the forested lands and ensure that forested corridors continue to be protected, as well as to consider these croplands and plantation lands and ensure that animals are able to move through these lands while negative interactions like the interactions that we just saw are sort of limited. So in terms of what is the definition of biological corridors nowadays, it's much broader. It doesn't just encompass forested corridors or habitat corridors. It encompasses any area that allows or facilitates animal movement or ecological connectivity from one place to another. And it encompasses the complexity that goes into this kind of process.
Thank you, Divya. You brought up two very important points, and one was human response, people's response, and the other one was where you are indicating that ecological connectivity, if that has to be protected or secured, then one needs to work beyond the forest patches. That brings me to something which is also very interesting, which is about human action. One is human response, another is that what actions are we taking? There are some groundbreaking research from abroad and our own country's research, which NCBS and UMAP and some of other students and other institutes which are doing. But based on those research findings, what are the actions which are being taken in the country to secure the connectivity? So I'll go to Milind. You've been a champion for corridors for almost a decade now, and your work has primarily been to focus on reducing infrastructure impacts in corridors and sometimes even within the habitats. So based on your observations, Milind, will you say that we, as a group of conservationists, have succeeded in the Kana-Pench corridor? Or do you think that there is more work ahead? Can you please summarize the three key learnings, the three top learnings, what has worked or what has not worked when it comes to securing such a corridor for wildlife?
Okay. Thank you, Dipankar. Coming specifically to the Kana-Pench corridor, I mean, over the last decade and a half, I mean, it has been what was called the National Highway 7. That was, the main point of contention, and which was the major threat for, connectivity of wild animals from, passing from Kana to Pench from one portion of the corridor to the other. And I would say that, I mean, whether we succeeded or not, I mean, I would like to take this question into two parts. I'd like to divide it into two parts. The first part, I would say, where we succeeded. What happened is when, the National Highway 7 was being built, when the construction started, it was in complete violation of all the laws. There was no NBWL approval in place, and yet the road construction work and the felling of trees had started. And at this point of time, the Ministry of Road Transport, the National Highways Authority of India, I mean, I would say the government wanted to build the road ASAP without any mitigation measures. And there was a concerted effort at multiple levels to bypass the protection given to corridors under the Wildlife Protection Act. So there was, this concerted effort to bypass the National Board of Wildlife. So on that particular front, it then boiled down to a question of whether there should be mitigation along, a road which is passing through a corridor, or whether there should be, no mitigation at all. So on that particular question of, protection under the Wildlife Protection Act for connectivity for corridors, and with relation to, whether mitigation should be there or not, I think we succeeded over there, because, there is mitigation measures on the road right now in the Kana-Pench corridor, and it is being effectively used by wild animals at the moment. And we succeeded as far as that portion is concerned, that, we got the mitigation measures. And in this particular case, this is the first time, I mean, after the 2006 amendment of the Wildlife Protection Act, which got in section 3801G, which is the main protection for connectivity. The first time that, the powers under, the Wildlife Protection Act, this specific power was exercised, was in the case of the Kana-Pench corridor. I mean, it took, 10 years for this power to get exercised. That's the first example. You go through all the minutes of the National Board of Wildlife. That's the first time you will find this, where, the whole matter was deliberated, under the, purview of section 3801G. So we did succeed in setting a precedent for all corridors across the country that, there needs to be certain mitigation measures. And coming to, the second part, where I would argue that, as a community, where we failed to, succeed in this particular case. And I'd like to, take a few minutes to say why. What happened is that, if you look into this case very deeply, when we at the Wildlife Trust of India first approached, the Central Empowered Committee, at that point of time, very few people know this, that the NHAI had offered to build a 9-kilometer long flyover, in the Kana-Pench corridor. And later on, what happened is, there was a series of reports by the Wildlife Institute of India, and where, the mitigation measures have been serially diluted one after the other, without giving any reasons as to why the previous set of mitigation measures have been abandoned. This particular case has been deliberated by the NBWL 11 times. Why does the board give so much leeway to the National Highway Authority of India? The board prescribes a certain set of mitigation measures, then NHAI comes back to the board, then the board is very tolerant. They again reduce the mitigation measures. It's happened 11 times. So, what has happened is there has been a lot of scientific capitulation, where, the mitigation measures have been reduced without any scientific reason at all. You go into the reports of the Wildlife Institute of India, there have been some astounding scientific somersaults. The alternate alignment which was proposed earlier, it goes through something which is called the Pench-Satpura corridor. Various all India estimation reports of the WII and the NTCA have called it fragile. They have called it a disconnected corridor. They have said this corridor needs serious restorative inputs. But when it comes to NH7 and trying to push through the case for, the road to go through the corridor, suddenly the same Wildlife Institute of India, turns around and it calls this corridor, the Pench-Satpura corridor, as offering excellent connectivity. I mean, in which dictionary, does excellent, qualify, is equal to fragile, is equal to disconnected, and is equal to, corridor needing restorative inputs. So, there have been multiple dilutions in the mitigation measures. And even, good forest officers, there was an Inspector General of Forests in Nagpur in the NTCA, Mr. Debabhrata Swain, who was vehemently objecting to all these dilutions. His name was removed from the report. You read the mitigation report, on the last page, it says that, Mr. Swain has to be part of the committee. And you look at the cover page, his name is not there. So the NTCA has itself, violated its own, principles. And, problems exist in the corridor even today. Look at one of the structures. It has been flooded perennially for the last 4 years. It's been 4 years since, the structures on the Maharashtra side were built. And, the structure has been flooded 365 days a year for the last 4 years. There are no noise and light barriers on the underpasses. You go to Madhya Pradesh, a few kilometers, 20 kilometers on the northern side of the same corridor, the same highway has got noise and light barriers. The same thing is lacking in Maharashtra. And, there are underlying roads below two of the largest underpasses. Two of the largest underpasses in Maharashtra, 750 meters. So, these are some of the most effective underpasses, or these should be the most effective in terms of, the diversity of species, in terms of the frequency of movement of individual animals, using those underpasses. And unfortunately, two of these larger structures have, underlying roads below them. They have sources of disturbance below them. So I think we have, failed on that particular front to, get mitigation measures which are scientifically valid.
Thanks, Milind. Yes, we learned some lessons, but I would like to draw upon one thing. You said that some of the underpasses are effectively used. We have seen even camera images of tigers using some of these underpasses.
Yes.
15 years back, or almost 17, 18 years back, when we started talking about linear infrastructure and that mitigation measures should be here, and we had examples from Canada and there were examples from Africa or other parts of Europe, the question that the conservation fraternity was always asked, will those work in India? So the one thing from Kanhar-Pench corridor, from NH7 and the mitigation structures, we know that things work. And that brings me to the next part of this very interesting matter, is that this whole balance of development versus conservation. So Gary, I'll come to you. India will very soon be the world's most populous country. There was a report on that. India also sustains about 70% of world's wild tigers. And our Honorable Prime Minister also is aiming that India should be reaching a $5 trillion in about 2.5 to 3 years' time, from the present $3.63 trillion or so. Now, at this critical juncture, where do you think India's greatest opportunities for connectivity conservation for tigers are? Do we need to do anything more? Do we need to strengthen something? What are your views?
Well, you're doing something right, because the tigers are coming back, and you have all these policies to support tiger connectivity. So that's number one. Enabling policy is so important. Now, as Milind says, you can have the policies and you don't actually implement them in the proper way. But if they are, and it seems that more or less you have, then that is a very good thing. What India is an example of, that Divya touched on, is coexistence. I know no country in the world that tolerates a carnivore, a big carnivore, like you do with tigers. I mean, it's astounding. The world, you know, there's a human cost, obviously, to living with wildlife, but we also have to put it in perspective that it is a compromise. I think it's a coexistence. It's a mutualism, having life with wildlife. They give us so much benefit. We have to learn to live with wildlife. Somehow in this industrial age, as our nations have grown, become more urbanized, we've kind of forgot how to live with wildlife in so many ways. And I think India leads the world in this regard. And that gives me hope, because the world, I think, looks to India as, how can we emulate this ability to live with wildlife, even though we know that there are challenges, very great challenges in doing so. The second part I think India is leading on is there is a coalition for wildlife corridors. As Dipankar, you said, I'm chair of the IUCN's specialist group on connectivity conservation. I work with many nations. We're in 135 nations around the world. And while there are many groups who work on wildlife corridors, India is the first where all the NGOs have gotten together to work together to put aside their competitive instincts, if you will, to be more collaborative, because capacity is thin, resources are thin, and the challenges are so great to try to find a new way of working on this issue of ecological connectivity for wildlife. And there are dozens of groups involved. And that is another example of how we have to work together. This is an all hands on deck moment in our planet. You know, the way we have done business before, where my organization is better than your organization, or my interests, you know, is more important than your interest, is not going to work. We have to be more collaborative with conservation. I think there's really great signals from India. You're involved, WWF-India is involved, many of the groups, all the groups here are involved with this coalition for wildlife corridors. That's the way forward. We aren't going to solve these grand problems if we do them by ourselves. It takes all of us. So, you know, in these two fronts, India is leading.
Thank you, Gary. What comes out from your deliberation is that there is hope, and I hope that
absolutely. Yeah.
And I hope that we are able to strengthen the collaboration, because that's important, you know, collaboration for connectivity. Uma, let me come to you. We have heard the challenges, and the challenges will increase with more development pressures, requirement of land, land use change happening at a rate which is far more faster than before. So are we looking at a future where our tigers in various landscapes will be genetically compromised? Will you please summarize for us what the key implications of the diverse strands of your research and your findings are there for future of tigers in our country?
Thank you. So that's a question which keeps me awake at night, actually. You know, I think the answer, like I tried to allude to it, is, you know, from all of the research we have more generally, of course, the answer is yes. But what specifically will play out, right? Are we going, like I said, you know, we have higher inbreeding in a specific population, Ranthambore. But what is the consequence of that? Will we see abnormalities like we did in Florida panthers, or what will we see? What is the trajectory, the real trajectory of these populations? I mentioned Simlipal and how it is isolated. So what if in 10 years or 20 years, all the tigers in Simlipal are black? Does that matter? So we are seeing these phenomena, these processes, and we conceptually link them to extinction. But I don't think we can yet say exactly what that trajectory is and how it will play out. I guess from a more broad perspective, as far as possible, we must you know, maintain functional connectivity. But there are already situations where it's not an option anymore. For example, what is the option of connectivity for Simlipal? It's simply too far. there are no sources which are, closer than 500 kilometers or more, right? So what is the option for Simlipal? So, I mean, I'm just using that as an example, but there are several populations like this. So maybe at some point in the future, we will have to consider assisted gene flow or movement of individuals. I think it would be good to better understand inbreeding effects, better understand, what we may expect to see. We can predict things like we predict, or our data shows an excess of deleterious alleles or potentially, bad alleles in Ranthambore. But how will this actually play out in the future is something we don't know yet. I think that if ever we have to resort to assisted gene flow or introduction of individuals, that should be based on science, and it should be a long-term plan. It should not be just pick up some problem individuals, drop them somewhere without a cognizance of behavior, how those individuals are ecologically going to integrate into those landscapes. Are there enough prey? These are all very important questions. The genetics can guide it theoretically, but on ground, integration of individuals into populations is a very different thing. And so I hope that if we come to that situation, we should have a scientific plan and collaboration, as you've all been saying. One of the things I sometimes feel a little sad about is, as scientists, we publish papers, and yes, there is some uptake, but it would be really nice if from the get-go we could work with managers, we could work with NGOs and co-create research, so that, it's the most effective versus research is published, there's some pushback, or, it challenges something. I think it would be really nice if that could be the way forward. Even for management potentially of connectivity will be required, I feel, in the future. And if so, it would be very nice if it could be done scientifically.
Thank you,
I hope that
Uma.
answers your question. Yeah.
Yes, it does. You elucidated very nicely how cutting-edge research is important and how the research findings need to be taken into management actions. If I may ask Divya, for these management actions to be started, or for some action research to be initiated, whether it is for active management or whether it is something what Divya has been saying, what Uma has been saying in terms of genetic research and science-guided actions, we also need to look at what is happening in the existing corridors. So India has about 30 odd tiger corridors. And do you think this is a comprehensive list or a representative list? You were talking about that, well, corridors are not linear stretches, and we should not just look at only the forested patches. We should look at multi-use landscapes as movement corridors. So what is the process of identifying and delineating corridors like, and what more needs to be done, especially for demarcating those, for getting more stakeholder involvement to secure functionality of these corridors? What are your views?
So the short answer, Dipankar, is that no, that's not the final list. But let me, I guess, take one step back and speak to why science is so important for connectivity conservation. And Milind actually laid the ground so well for that. How do you reconcile a fantastic corridor with, excellent corridor, I think he said, and excellent with a fragile corridor? How do you reconcile the two? And the answer is that you use scientific approaches that specifically are aimed at asking how good is a particular area for maintaining connectivity. And there are methods to do that nowadays. There are methods to collect various different forms of data. It could be genetic, it could be from radio collaring, it could be, we've used science surveys, we've used systematic crowdsourcing. So collecting this data to kind of assess how well connected are 2 points or 2 patches, 2 forests, and how well is a particular corridor doing, or how important is a particular corridor for connecting those 2 patches. So you no longer need to say it's fantastic or it's fabulous or it's excellent or it's not so good or it's fragile. You have scientific backing to actually to say that. To go to your question, the a list of 31 is clearly not an extensive list. We do need to have a lot more research that goes into connectivity conservation and to identifying corridors, not just for tigers, but for other animals as well. I've spoken about elephants, and that's an important species again, which is a wide-ranging species. But there are other animals that are severely affected by fragmentation as well. And so whether it is for the tiger or for elephants or other wildlife, we certainly need more work done on identifying corridors, and that there are improvements in scientific approaches that allow us to, like I said, collect different forms of information and assess what are the most important locations for connectivity, which are the most important areas that are allowing for connectivity. And not just that, what is it that is limiting a tiger from moving from forest A to forest B? And that is also extremely important. So when you're speaking to actions that are taken to conserve connectivity, there is one form of action, which is where do I put my resources? Where do I demarcate a corridor? I'm going to demarcate this location as a corridor. So that is an answer to a where question. Where are the animals moving? But there's also a why question. Why are animals not moving through this particular corridor? Why is this corridor fragile? And if we can understand those things, and it is possible to understand those things using science and using the models that Uma touched upon, and there are other models as well, associated models as well, all of these things can really serve to spur action, whether it's from the government or whether it's from NGOs or whether it's from a group, collaboration across different actors who are playing. All of these things are important for maintaining connectivity. So I'd just like to also just touch upon, I guess, the stakeholder interaction, because you spoke about that as well. So for forested corridors, it's really important. So if you think about connectivity, it can happen through government-owned or government-managed forested corridors, and it can happen through individually or privately owned or community-owned lands. So for the government-managed corridors, I think it really needs to be emphasized that it's important to ensure that those forests are not diverted or not lost. These forests may not, at the face of it, look like it's very important. It's not going to be the forest that you go to for a safari to see tigers. No, it's not. It's a forest where a tiger occasionally moves through, but it is the lifeline of your Bandhavgars and your Kanas, which are like the key source populations in, or at least some key source populations in India. So it is critical to ensure that those forests are not lost and not diverted. The second aspect of it is working with individual owners of land or communities or corporates to ensure that animals are able to move through these lands. And there are various different things that are required for that, and that's often dependent on small things that have on the local context. I can give you an example of the work that we're doing over here in Assam, which is on elephants and not tigers, but it still holds. So we work with tea plantations over here, trying to allow and trying to facilitate elephant movement across tea plantations while minimizing negative interactions between people and elephants. And there is a lot of engagement. There is a lot of listening to their concerns about what are the limits in terms of what is it that is stopping them, or what are their concerns in terms of allowing animals to move through. And it requires engagement with them, understanding those concerns and addressing those concerns to ensure that movement can happen while negative interactions are minimized and while positive human-wildlife interactions are strengthened. And I'd like to emphasize also this positive human-wildlife interactions. Thanks, Gary, for bringing up this thing of positive human interactions in India. And that is true. In interactions that we found, for instance, about 95% of people said that we are happy with or were extremely supportive of elephants. That came down to about 40 to 50% when we asked, okay, are you okay with elephants in your backyard? That's still a high percentage, but it did come down. And our job is to figure out how to make that 40% go up towards the 90%.
Divya, thank you. I think, two things, although we are talking about connectivity, but you mentioned about interaction. positive interaction or negative interaction. I think that's the way forward. The moment we say it's human-tiger conflict or human-elephant conflict, we have already given it a negative connotation and not looking for a solution. The moment we say interaction, we're more neutral and trying to look for some kind of solutions. Divya, you also talked about securing forest patches outside protected areas. And then at times what we have seen is that India's courts, the judiciary, is coming to the rescue of wildlife and habitats. And I have somebody here who has gone to the courts to make a case for NH7, and that's Milind. Milind, what did you learn about using litigation as a tool for protecting corridors from degradation? And how relevant do you see this approach in the time to come? Because given the roads and highways in India are going at a faster pace than you and I can imagine. Over to you, Milind.
Okay. I couldn't hear you properly. I mean, there was a loss in connection. Could you repeat the question, please? Yes. I only heard, how relevant is it in current? I think I heard the second part of the question.
Okay. I was saying that you have gone to courts to make a case for National Highway 7.
Okay.
What did you learn about using litigation as a tool for protecting corridors from further degradation?
Okay.
And then how relevant do you see this approach in the years to come, given the present push for highways and roads expansion and construction?
Okay, I got your question. I think in the first part, I missed out one of your questions where you'd asked me about, a couple of learnings also, from litigation when it comes to securing a corridor. I think I'd like to answer that first because, there have been certain important statements which both Uma and Divya also made. So, it is connected to that. So I'll just take a minute to, answer that particular question I missed first. One of the learnings that, I found, from the Kana-Pench corridor story, the entire, decade-long story is that, the first thing that we need is proper, scientific delineation of corridors. We need good methods of, delineating corridors. I'd like to take a moment to, tell an anecdote, which again, not many people may know, because this is what happens in the courtrooms and, there are no witnesses and there's no live streaming in the courtrooms, yet, at least in 2015, there wasn't. So the NHAI was always making an argument that they will not build mitigation measures in the southern part of the corridor. And the reason why is because, the Wildlife Institute of India, the NTCA, in various reports, they have used a method called the least cost path, which passes through the northern portion of the corridor in Madhya Pradesh. So they were saying that the southern portion is not a corridor and therefore, no mitigation measures are required. And at that point of time, Ritvik and I, we were both standing in court. I was, a couple of steps behind Ritvik and, I immediately said, turn to page 87 in a WIR report. And we showed them a circuitscape map, which was showing flow values in the Maharashtra area as well. And we immediately told, the court saying, that, look, there's a map here by the same Wildlife Institute of India. And this area is also a corridor. So this was really the turning point when NHAI immediately made an admission saying they will build 750-meter long underpasses in Maharashtra. This was a verbal statement made by their counsel, Mr. Pinaki Mishra. But that was really the turning point where NHAI actually, conceded a point and, they started agreeing to mitigation measures. And it happened because of good maps. I mean, I have earlier criticized the Wildlife Institute of India. Not everything that comes out of there is bad. It's an institution in itself and, many good things have come out of there and we've utilized them in the courts for effective conservation. And similarly, either the presence or the lack of good maps is what makes or breaks, a conservation issue. Now, pointing out to, something that Uma also brought up, like Simlipal, and she's been talking about the deleterious effects of, lack of connectivity and, various issues which is so very well explained. Just take a look at, the underestimate of, corridors, the way we have identified our corridors. It's a vast underestimate. Just take a look at the TCPs in the state of Odisha. which has, I think, probably 65,000 square kilometers of forest. It is one of the larger and greener states in the central Indian landscape. There is just one corridor as per the NTCA. I mean, if we are going to identify one corridor in the entire state of Odisha, and this is, after 15 years of good science, we have got all the data available, to do the analysis. We have got all the scientific firepower. How are we going to conserve corridors if we, end up identifying just one corridor? I'm not even talking about the other central Indian landscape, which again is a vast underestimate. And I'm just giving this one example, which is a stark, example. That's why I'm taking Odisha. So that was the first part of, the question that I missed answering. Now coming to your question about, the learnings, of using litigation as a tool. What I would say is that, we've always, I mean, it has never been me alone fighting this Kana-Pench corridor battle. It's always been, a bunch of individuals and, small NGOs who have been, effective, helping me day in and day out on this issue. We have always used litigation as a tool of the last resort. We have tried other ways and means of, trying to convince the authorities to save the corridors. And when all else has failed, then we were left with nothing else, and we have used litigation as a tool. So we have used it as a tool of the last resort. However, I would say that, litigation also, many people, I mean, many times, even my own parents have come and told me saying, why are you going to the courts? There's a lot of stigma attached to litigation and going to courts. I would say that, it is not like that. What we are doing is, these litigation are not, something that, we are doing for our personal gain. These are issues of public interest. And, we are doing it for a larger cause. We are doing it for the environment. We are doing it for the nation. And that is something that, everyone who, shies away from litigation should remember. And that this is also part of our constitutional duty, to, do litigation if it requires. I mean, if when all else has failed and, there's no other means to, save a particular corridor, then, go to the court by all means. That is where you will get justice. That is why this country has set up courts, for the common man to go and knock on the doors and get justice. So that's my learning of using, litigation as a, measure to, as a conservation measure, as a conservation method. And asking how relevant it is in current day and time. I mean, as far as we just, about 3 months ago went to Jabalpur High Court, and, the Satpura Melghat corridor, which is again an important corridor, very well forested corridor, connecting two of the largest tiger reserves in the central Indian landscape. There are 3 roads going through this. And it is the same old story. I mean, one would imagine that, Kana-Pench corridor, after all the litigation, after all the noise that has been made in the media, one would have learned from the mistakes. But, it's not the case. I mean, the NHAI is still going and seeking permissions and suppressing facts over there. And in the Kana-Pench, in the case of the Satpura Melghat corridor, I mean, was the corridor an unknown one? Definitely not. It is part of the TCP of Satpura Tiger Reserve. It is part of the TCP of Melghat Tiger Reserve. Both the TCPs have mentioned it, they have mapped it. Everyone here is aware that this area is a corridor. And yet, I mean, nobody has taken a single step to save this corridor. And we have gone to court and we have obtained a stay against the National Highway Authority of India that, they will not build this road until and unless mitigation measures are built on that particular highway. So it's relevant even now because, there are so many cases where, we are slipping up that, conservationists need to be on the vigil at all times. As Gary also mentioned, he said all hands on deck. I'd say we need to be alert at every given point of time and, not lose our focus on this and be ready to take action if the moment demands it. Thank you.
Thank you, Milind. We have just completed about an hour into this session today. We might have a little more time to take at least a couple of more questions with the panelists. But I would also request the audience, first of all, thanks for joining today's session. And I would request to raise your hand in case you have a question, and then our host will get your chat on the chat box. Milind, you are talking about land use, and you are also talking a bit about how some of the challenges where I mean, they kind of pushed you to go to the court, and you probably got questions from your own parents. I would like to go to Gary. Is that so look at something which is to do with the land use change, the land tenure in the corridors, and in absence of an overarching land use policy in the country, we see multi-sectoral engagement. Gary, you yourself said that they're all hands on the deck, and we need to have all government sectors. We have also seen the National Highways Authority of India, and primarily the MORTH, the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, at one point of time came up with a notification, and Milind will also remember that as much as possible, take the roads outside the and stuff. So Gary,
yes, under Bharatmala.
Correct. So Gary, what do you think? What does it take to operationalize multi-sectoral engagement? And do you have examples to share where such approaches have succeeded elsewhere in the world?
Well, they're succeeding more because people realize with climate change, I think two things are happening. People are getting a sense of the scale of fragmentation. There's much more data out there, thanks to the scientists on this call and others who are showing the scale of fragmentation. I think people are more attuned to climate. I think the scale of fragmentation, the scale of climate is making people pay attention more to these broader cumulative impacts that we've have never, we really weren't able to assess mentally. Now we're starting to see all this big data come together. A lot of the satellite imagery is out there. There's been a fundamental change. For instance, I think the data that we're getting is the science that we're getting is fundamentally changed. We've been getting for decades snapshots of the problem. You get a picture, a map, and that map is based on data, sometimes 10 years old, sometimes 5 years old, but it's not real time. It's not what happened yesterday. And now we're starting to get data sources that give us information in real time. And it's kind of like the revolution that's happened in medicine, where people have MRIs and these different kind of imaging. We're getting this kind of new imaging, and we can see this. So that allows more people to have access to information. Now, connectivity by itself, the big secret of conservation is that conservation doesn't just happen on protected areas. It happens on all lands and waters. The biosphere, what creates life on Earth, is the interaction of all species in a positive way that creates the living condition for everyone to survive. The fact that we have chopped up nature so much, we're kind of undermining this interactive process. So connectivity, these corridors where animals need to move, wildlife, they require conversations. They require commitment. They require shared processes to bring people together across jurisdictions, across cultures. It is happening, in the last 20 years, connectivity conservation has grown exponentially, kind of like the hockey stick that people show for climate change. And that's because no one can take on a lot of these challenges, by just working on their parcel, on what they can control. The government can't do it alone. The private landowners can't do it alone. The indigenous communities can't do it alone. It requires a collective effort. So I think the practice of conservation is moving. Yes, there is the importance of, like Milind does with the legal approach, and that is very powerful. But there's a lot going on, what we call collaborative conservation, on the ground, working with folks in unique ways. And you're asking, has this work? Is this working? Yeah, it's working in various places around the world where people are ability to have roundtables. That's what we call them, where you bring people together, and you have to bring them together on a regular basis And the successful roundtables always have a coordinator. And a lot of people roll their eyes because it's process. Oh, we don't need more process because what we want is a solution. Well, the solution is the process, and that's what makes durable, long-lasting conservation, is because you engage people. They don't walk away. They don't say, oh, we got a big win and now we can go on, and forget about any of these problems that we have. No, problems are continually happening. Health is a continuous process. And in order to save nature, we have to have this continual conversation. The reality also is that a lot of people who went into wildlife work don't want to speak to people. And that's not how they're trained. They're not necessarily trained to work with people. So there are new skills that are arising with folks who work on wildlife and in wildlife conservation. It's all about working with people. So I think so in summary, just going back, the way we're collecting information engages more people. The problem now has to involve more people, and the solutions are involving those people in ways that are collaborative, long-term, and sustained. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Gary, quite well elaborated. We also have some quite a few interesting questions from the audience, and I have a question for the host. Maybe we could take some audience questions. Will you be able to unmute some of the members from the audience and let them ask questions, or do I paraphrase some of the questions? Any response from the host?
We'll unmute them.
There was a question from, there are a couple of questions from Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. Will you please unmute him and request him?
Yes, he's unmuted.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely fascinating conversation. Learning so much. So Uma said there are probably 6 populations of 100 or 100 plus tigers. And which are the next 6 such populations? And these corridors are to be secured, maintained. Is the forest department the best way? And the second question is related to this, which is that given that when you are using the word corridor, we are using the word corridor. We are not looking at forest department lands. We're looking at other categories of land. And the issues of crop, human loss of life, livestock, and a whole range of issues may require a different kind of sociological rigor, understanding of those issues. So are we looking at partners other than the forest department tackling those? Thank you.
Anyone from the panel? Uma, would you like to take that?
So, so Mahesh, maybe I'll just clarify. I said there's 4 populations or so, I don't know the exact number, of more than 150 individuals. And that is basically if you just look at the number of individuals in a particular tiger reserve. So, unfortunately, in terms of which tiger reserves can we actually increase population size in, I think that there's potential for increase in, say, tiger reserves in Odisha and other parts of the country. But a lot of the kind of, the big name ones are potentially close to carrying capacity. I'm not 100% sure about this. Maybe Milind or someone else can correct me. So packing in more tigers into, some of these already packed tiger reserves might be. Yeah. Milind, do you want to add something or?
I think to answer Mahesh's question, certainly in central India, if you look at Tadoba, then both the Pench Tiger Reserves put together and then Kana Tiger Reserve, they would be somewhere close to that, figure 100. Of 100 individuals, whichever way you define it. Some people say 25 adult females, some people say 100 adult individuals. So these 3 populations should be somewhere close, give or take maybe, 10 individuals here or there.
Yeah.
So, and then as Uma is saying, some of these reserves may be close to carrying capacity. probably Tadoba, some parts of Kana certainly. Half of Kana has got extremely low densities on the Supkar side, but the tourism areas have higher densities. And there's great potential. I mean, just look at the state of Odisha. If you pack in tigers at one tiger per 100 square kilometer, you will have 600 additional tigers. That's 60% growth in the Central Indian tiger landscape population. So definitely the scope.
Yeah, and also Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand potentially where prey densities can be increased, which would allow for additional tigers. So I guess I mean, I think the best way forward is also, it's not just corridors. There has to be increase in possible sources as well. More populations which are demographically, doing well. Otherwise, connectivity will not be possible. However much you protect the corridors, there have to be individuals who are available to move. So it is a continual effort to increase numbers. I'm not saying that numbers are not important, but at the same time, configurations such that they can be much larger and larger landscapes, I think would be really key for the future.
Thanks, Uma and Milind. We have a very pertinent question from another viewer, another member of the audience, Roger, who is asking, is there any possibility of tigers surviving without managed conservation? Would you like to take that?
Well, I guess they are to some extent. I mean, they are surviving without managed conservation in large parts of their range and in large parts of India today. I think that, of course, there's two sides to it also, right? As connectivity increases, negative interactions or, of course, we would hope for coexistence, but there's also a possibility of conflict. And so management is not only about maybe in the future assisted gene flow, but also potential removal, or I'm saying potentially conflict could require management. So I don't know, maybe I'm pessimistic, but I think that the future, like if I'm talking about 20 years from now, I think management is going to be a part of tiger conservation, but maybe you can correct me if you think I'm being too pessimistic.
I just thought I'd say a couple of things over here. One is that tigers are pretty amazing. They travel across some startling distances, and genetics has shown us that actually, and they can, as well as camera trapping. There have been tigers which have been caught on cameras or where the genetics has shown that they have traveled straight line distances of 300, 400 kilometers. These are straight line distances across some pretty heavily disturbed areas. A few years back, there was a dispersing tiger that was caught in Medzifima, which is in Nagaland, quite far away from a good population. The nearest good population, I guess, is Kaziranga, but it would have to go through some pretty difficult stretch to get to this area. So tigers can move across some pretty large and amazing distances, and they are not like elephants. So if an elephant is moving through your backyard, the next day you know. But if tigers move through your backyard, sometimes they move through without knowing. So in this example, for instance, in Medzifima, we went to the village, we went to the neighboring villages, and we tried to track down where the tiger had actually come from. And it is possible sometimes that they move through areas and people just don't realize that they move through these areas. So I'd just like to make couple of points with respect to this. One is that, yes, while tigers move through human inhabited areas, there is a possibility of conflict, but it is not necessarily an end event. It's not necessarily the outcome. There can be an outcome of the tiger just moving through and people just not even realizing that the tiger has moved through. There can be, for instance, in Kaziranga, when the floods happen, tigers have to move through human inhabited areas. I'm sure some of you saw a photo of a tiger in a shop. And the people who were living over there called the forest department. The tiger was then rescued and moved out. And so it is not always the end game. Conflict is not always the end game. That's the one point that I wanted to make. The second point is that Tigers, like I said, tigers are amazing creatures. They can move across these really large distances if we just allow them to do so.
I'd like to just add in there that emphasizing Uma's good point is that connectivity is important, but having more core habitat is critical. And there are innovative conservation efforts going on with private landowners and indigenous communities around the world. Essentially, you can think of it like this: you could grow cotton or you could grow tigers, and there are compensation and economic strategies, and there's something called like rhino impact bonds in Africa. They're a type of investment mechanism to increase rhino numbers and habitat in Africa. People are investing in these impact bonds. You could have tiger impact bonds that would support local communities to grow better tiger habitat. And it's another market. And these are the kind of innovations that are coming forward that could have great potential in India.
Thanks, Gary. What Divya was also saying, that tigers moving through human-dominated spaces, we have also seen that there is an existing SOP from the National Tiger Conservation Authority, which says that if a tiger is dispersing through human-dominated spaces, local community should be informed through the panchayat, and there should be a member from the local community in the monitoring team. So I have a question for Gary. We all recognize that there is a very critical role of local communities. So what is the thinking of IUCN, and now you are the chair of the Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, particularly for involving communities or strengthening their role in connectivity conservation? What are the thoughts like?
Well, I think the fact that traditional knowledge is being used more in ecological and policy making is important. It is kind of obvious when you think about, maybe people did learn something about living, tens of thousands of years in a landscape, understanding all the, and being observers of the ecology in that landscape, may have some insightful ways of managing that landscape and its wildlife, might be an important factor in conservation. I think is you think it's what we would call a no-brainer, but it's only just recently that it's being widely accepted. So I just think that there's a lot of innovation going on with old knowledge, if you will. New ways of looking at old knowledge, and I think that's really fundamentally changing conservation. Indigenous protected areas are rising as a new form of conservation, allowing for co-management with indigenous peoples. I think there's a lot to be said here. It's not that it doesn't displace science. I just think that you have something that has blends the two, and that we can learn from different ways of knowing. There's not always one way to solve a problem. So it's happening, and this is part of the new trend.
Thank you, Gary. As you stated that we need to have a strong community constituency, we also need to have more active roles from other stakeholders. Uma, if I may come to you, what do you suggest as citizens, scientists, government officers, do to avert crisis that we have in connectivity conservation? Some of the examples that Milind had given, or some of the stochastic challenges that we were talking about. And particularly when it comes to land use change, what sort of changes are projected which will have deleterious impact on tiger population or long-term survival of tigers in the country?
I mean, basically fragmentation, right? And as Gary showed, the paved world, it's a nice phrase, interesting phrase. And, we are seeing it already. That's why maybe I sound pessimistic, because I'm thinking about 50 years, 100 years from now. And so I think that, I hope though, that clearly protected areas are not enough, right? All of India's protected areas are 3 times the size of Kruger. our protected areas are really small. So clearly these novel approaches, and maybe that's where I'm being old-fashioned, these novel approaches, restoration, community engagement and facilitation of movement. And even if we don't have, of course, increased habitat protection, but also, stepping stone corridors, kind of models where animals can actually, rest and then move on, even if they are far away, these whatever optimal habitat patches. But I don't know, maybe someone else can contradict me, but the future looks super fragmented to me, with increased human population size, density, and very much more edge, sharper edge between high density humans and wildlife. So unless that can be softened in some way, maybe through restoration, through other types of land management, that's the only option.
Thanks, Uma. Thanks, Uma. Yes. It gives some hope, but there is a bit of despair also. Talking about tigers going through or moving through human-dominated spaces, including agriculture areas. While this offers hope for tigers in areas where forest connectivity has been lost or where the edge is hard edge, options to effectively protect and manage such spaces seem to be quite sparse, and especially when quite a bit of land ownership is private. So Divya, my next question to you would be, what options do we have? And are there any examples for corridors being maintained on privately owned land in India for tigers or any other species?
We know that tigers are moving through privately owned lands. We know that elephants and other species are moving through privately owned lands. The corridors are there. The question is maintaining and ensuring that they continue into the future. And currently, I think some of our conservation actions are helping that. But I think some of the actions that we take are not helping that. For instance, and that, I guess, adds to Uma's call for despair, maybe, but maybe there's hope in the future also. But for instance, we are putting up fences around a lot of our protected areas. We've been doing that a little bit in the past, and we're doing it now still. There are fences between administrative boundaries of forests. So obviously, these are not conducive with ideas of connectivity. If animals come out of parks, often our go-to approach is either to chase them back into the park or to capture them and put them away in captivity. This again is it's pretty much fragmenting the area because it's blocking the connectivity that's there between one forest and another. So going back to the question that was raised before, it is critical that we work in different ways with the communities and with the people who are living in these areas, such that the corridors that are already there continue to be corridors. And in terms of whether things have worked or have not worked, I think we have not really made a concerted policy approach to address this issue. There has not been a concerted policy to incentivize areas that fall under locations that facilitate connectivity, and those kind of approaches need to be there. There needs to be, for instance, collaborations not just across the government and NGOs, but across different departments of the government itself to ensure that animals can move across these private lands while any negative interactions are reduced.
Yeah, thanks, Divya. And yes, I think the despair is catching up with me also. I mean, I'm not sure whether that is coming in.
Please, Dipankar, don't despair. There's great deal of
there is hope.
There is hope. And the fact that the numbers of tigers in India are growing, yes, given these challenges is a signal.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I would like to ask a question of Milind. And Milind, you know about litigations. You have used litigation as a tool. But we have heard about despair, and we have also seen whether on one side we see India's tigers growing. We have also seen the problem of linear infrastructure, fragmenting the landscapes, not just corridors, but large landscapes are getting fragmented. So what do you think is a remedy for maintaining structural and functional connectivity? What policies are needed, or do we need better implementation, or do you think we need to engage more with stakeholders, multi-stakeholder platforms beyond the usual stakeholders? So do you see, is there any optimism there? Do you think we can do something better, something more?
Yes, I mean, certainly, and it is a complicated situation, as I think, some of the panelists here and some of the audience also pointed out in their questions. And I do see, some scope for optimism here, definitely. And however, we need to, have some changes in the way we are operating. So if you look at the Wildlife Protection Act, the tiger conservation plans are, one of the key elements of the written down in the law. So it makes it a legal document. And however, I would say that, the forest departments have delayed a lot in, writing up, TCPs and getting them approved. It's taken like 15, 16 years, in the case of some tiger reserves, to get TCPs in place. And I think also there was something else which came up in the discussion. Gary and Uma also spoke about this, that there are ecological processes, which are operating at far larger scales than the scale of an individual TCP. So I think we first need to get our TCPs in place. And if there is capacity lacking within the government, then I think the government should approach the NGOs. There's, sufficient scientific expertise in, NGOs, conservation expertise available with NGOs, and, the expertise can be roped in to, get the TCPs out faster. We need to, at least get the corridor chapters out, revised and, out in the next 1 year with, proper delineation using good scientific methods that are not very restrictive. I think we need to first get rid of the LCPs, which is a very restrictive method of defining corridors. We need a much more inclusive method. That's number one, define the corridors well. Second thing, get the TCPs in place. And because ecological processes are operating at a much larger scale than that of an individual TCP also, I think we now need to move on to landscape scale management plans and get that landscape thinking into, the minds of the individual forest department officers. We've got like working plans, we've got management plans, we've got TCPs. Let's start looking at landscape scale management plans. And that probably will get, all those complicated problems, the complicated dimensions that we've been thinking about, we could probably, write down solutions to them, potential solutions. So as long as there's a plan, it can be implemented properly. So that would be the first step, in my opinion.
Thanks, Milind. And what we've also seen is that quite a few forest officers, young or old, experienced, somebody who is very fresh, we saw it in the IGNFA, they are looking forward to have these alliances. They are looking forward, recently met a forest officer who was a doctor by profession and became an IFS officer, who was looking for something to do with the medical fraternity, and said that how can we get support from them? So I see that, yes, there is despair, but there is hope. Gary, you have been champion of hope. And
Dipankar, can I just quickly add that since Milind brought up the WLPA, we have been talking about science so much during this past hour and a half or so, but the Wildlife Protection Act does not champion science where it should. There should be science and conservation that goes together. That improves our knowledge and that allows us to do our conservation better. And there have to be steps taken from the foundation till the implementation that facilitates that happening.
Thanks, Divya. I think that's a pointer for the host and most of us to have another discussion, because the Wildlife Protection Act itself and the need a separate discussion. Let me, I'm a little mindful of the time, and we also need to take some questions from the audience. There has been quite a few interesting ones. Gary, let me come to you. Through your organization, you have created some very strong alliances to secure animal movement pathways over thousands of square kilometers. Yellowstone to Yukon is one example. Can you tell us about what it takes to get people together to collaborate to secure such expansive animal movement pathways, and what keeps such initiatives going over time? How important have conservation easements have been in this? You need to unmute.
Yes,
yourself.
no, something happened. So first of all, you need a vision. People cannot respond unless they are inspired. That's why hope is so important. Even, you look at the great leaders of the world, even when there's, the chances are thin and their challenges are so great, the only way to inspire people to take action and to try to improve their situation is you have to really provide an image of a more hopeful future. And vision is everything in conservation. In fact, conservation is this blend of vision and vigilance. You can't have people to, try hard every day unless there's a vision that drives them. So Yellowstone to Yukon, or any large landscape effort, or what's going on in central India or the Charai Arc or Assam, the reason they're working is because in some aspect of it, there's a vision there. The Western Ghats, there's some, long-term goal that people aspire, and that their actions are going to have some impact to achieve that long-term goal. So that is the key element. I forgot, Dipankar, because there's something happened to my computer right there. You said something at the very end, and could you rephrase that or say that again?
Yes, I was asking, how important have conservation easements have been?
Oh, easements, yeah. Oh, they're growing. In fact, the easement world, yeah, and for those who don't know, easements are where there's some kind of either donation or purchase of a development right on a private or indigenous land that supports conservation. And this kind of mechanism, conservation tool, is exploding. Now, in the United States, there are tax laws that support this. So people really get a benefit, a tax benefit, from providing some kind of conservation easement on their property. And it is part of the future, because as I said before, conservation happens on all lands and waters, and that it requires work with private landowners, with industry, and with indigenous people, because connectivity is really the expression of the movement ecology across these kind of tenures that allow for protected areas to work better and be more effective.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Let us take some, we have about 23 minutes left. Let us take some questions, and I would request the audience to put their questions on the chat so that we don't lose much time. We have a question from Rushikesh, and he's asking, corridors are always in the context of animal movement, which barely shake anything in the political economy. Does it make sense, or does it make a case for ecological security, and corridors make more sense? And how does one do that? So I think the essence of the question is, how do we grab the attention of the decision makers, of the policy makers? Yes, Uma.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to answer that question. It's this is kind of a bit of a plug, but recently, several of us, Dipankar, you included, and Divya, and Arjun Srivatsa, and several of us worked together on a paper where we're actually trying to look at defining these larger landscapes from a perspective of ecosystem services, threats, as well as biodiversity conservation. And this is something which we've just sent off, and I hope that those types of approaches, which it also considers, the Indian government has these, the Niti Aayog has these aspirational districts. It actually looks at where development is prioritized, where human socioeconomic index should be improved, and tries to synthesize these various types of priorities that, say, a government may have, and bring them in line with thinking about biodiversity in the future. So I mean, this is one example, but I think integrating these with maps, right? Milind mentioned the power of maps, not just talking about them theoretically, not just saying ecosystem services require large landscapes, but showing what those landscapes are on a map. I hope that those will be ways to really push for these and policies in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Uma. Thanks, Uma. We have quite a few questions from Pramik Kannan, and Pramik's one question grabbed my attention. He's asking, enumeration of ecosystem services in monetary terms is not something that has been explored in India a whole lot. Does doing so have potential for maintenance of natural habitats? And I'm thinking that he has probably asked it from the point of corridor conservation. Gary or Divya, would you like to take that up? Go ahead, Divya.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I think that it is extremely important to enumerate ecosystem services. There is and nature capital, as it's called increasingly. This is not just the ecosystem services that are tangible in terms of water. Water is extremely important. We are under severe water stress. Clean air is obviously, some of us who are sitting in cities are very jealous of the clean air that Gary is getting sitting next to a forest. But also there are other non-tangible values as well, such as the aesthetic pleasure that you get from experiencing nature, and these kind of things are also getting included in the larger definition of ecosystem services. Across the world, there is a concerted effort to improve the way in which we're accounting for this nature capital. And some of these methods are coming to India as well. And I hope that in the next 2 decades, we're going to have an increase in the amount of knowledge that we have on the nature capital that we have in India. Like Uma said, we worked on a paper together that looked at ecosystem services, looked at the spatial distribution of ecosystem services across India. But there is also the question of actually looking at, all right, how much are we getting from nature? And there has been some work done on that in the past, but I'm expecting that the next decade or so is going to see a spurt of activity in terms of that. Is it going to be useful? Oh yeah, it's going to be tremendously useful, because I think that it's really going to drive home how important it is to conserve these forests, and in ways that is affecting you and me, in ways that it's affecting pretty much everybody across the globe. So I think once we make that link, it's going to be the stake that people have in conservation hopefully is going to become a lot more clear.
And I'll only add that we have a huge carbon market here in North America, and it's growing in other parts of the world. I mean, climate change is creating a new way of doing conservation. And I think if we grow trees or we grow flood control, we are also growing habitat for tigers. So I think there are many win-wins here, and I think that's a huge potential.
Thanks. Just one last audience question before I request the panelists for their closing remarks. Arindran is asking, is relocation a good solution to maintain numbers where population density is low? And I presume Arindran is asking about translocation of tigers. Gary, you are unmuted. Would you like to take that?
No, this is Uma. This is totally Uma.
This part again. So relocation of tigers in low density areas, I think the most important thing is to look at prey density, right? I mean, I think it's really important to, we've had failed translocations in the past, right? So I think the most important thing when doing a relocation or a translocation to an area where there's low density particularly is to ensure that the area you're moving individuals to is ecologically ready to have a high tiger numbers or increased numbers of individuals. If there's no prey, then there isn't much point introducing individuals into a pretty bad habitat. So I think that a protection of prey is always is the first step to improving habitat quality. There's several papers, Karan's classic paper, which show that prey, I mean, all carnivores need prey. So I think that those ecological considerations are important before we start just randomly moving animals. That's one of the things that people are nervous about, that in some sense, translocation and one other way to look at it is to say, why bother about connectivity? Let's just fence the protected areas. Let's just move animals around, right? We don't want that. We don't want that at all. So I think that it's really important to protect habitat, maintain functional connectivity, understand animal movement, try and manage landscapes in different ways to facilitate resting or whatever movement of animals, even if not resident there and breeding there. And I think that translocation should be kind of a last option, and only when there's really no way out for a population. Thank you.
Thanks, Uma. It's time for closing remarks from the panelists, and here's the question. We'll go in reverse order. So start with Milind, Divya, Uma, and then I'll have something from Gary. Panelists, if you have one prescription, one suggestion to make for strengthening tiger connectivity conservation in India, what would that be? Milind, and then Divya.
My one recommendation, the most important, I would definitely choose, having good connectivity maps, which do not underestimate the connectivity. Like, I work in the Central Indian landscape, and, if you look at the legal definition of corridors, we've got 150 corridors in Central India. Whereas if you look at our statutory documents in the current time, I think we have something like 23 corridors, which is a vast underestimate. So we need to have widely accepted methods. There are plenty of good methods out there to identify our corridors. We need to use those and not go back to some archaic methods. So getting good maps and not underestimating, which actually estimates connectivity properly, that is the most important step that I would start, point out.
Thanks, Milind. Maps, yes. Visuals. Divya.
Well, Milind already stole my good science point, so then so I'm gonna break the rules over here and make two recommendations. One is it's extremely important to ensure that our forestry corridors are not lost and not diverted. That's extremely critical. And the second is to expand our policy towards connectivity conservation such that it incorporates stakeholder involvement and stakeholder engagement in the fullest way possible, such that we can facilitate the continuation of animal movement through private lands. That's my 2 points.
Thanks, Divya. Uma.
So, I guess they've said really important things, both Divya and Milind, and they're both practitioners. And I'm conscious that I'm a scientist. I think that it's really important to work together. I think, these new efforts like Coalition of Corridors, I hope that they will grow. And in general, I hope this doesn't come across negatively, but a lot of conservation has been dominated by strong personalities and points of view. But in the future, all hands on deck, collaboration between government, scientists in academia, people in NGOs, industry, across the board, to come up with solutions together. This is again more about process, but we know it's a challenge, but I think that's the only way forward. And I really hope to see a future where everyone is really working together to maintain connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma. I think that despair is we hopeful, and as I can see, some of the audience members from the audience are also writing that yes, we are hopeful. And so we have visuals, maps, we have signs, and collaboration. So Gary, I'm going to ask you a little more, given your global experience. Inspire us, as you always do, through examples of some clear, crisp policy-level initiatives which has been used for securing landscape connectivity at large scale. And in those, what excites you the most And are there some elements of those that you see which we can transfer to tiger corridors in India through the coalition, partnering with institutes, partnering with governments, partnering with communities, researchers, everyone? Over to you, Gary.
Well, there are something like 60 nations around the world, maybe it's more, are all part of the High Ambition Coalition. They have signed on to save more of nature. There's this conversation about saving 30% of nature by the year 2030. Some are even going further and saying that we need to have at least 50% of the planet nature friendly by 2050. What this all is that there's this whole policy conversation happening around the world, and connectivity is part of that. It's not just growing protected areas, it's also about increasing the effectiveness of protected areas. Canada announced about 2 months ago a multi-billion Canadian dollar effort to protect corridors in Canada. It's like, India only wishes it had the problems that Canada has with regards to the amount of habitat the Canadians have. It's one of the most wild places in the world. Yet it's concerned about fragmentation and connectivity now before it even gets worse. So I think the nations around the world are creating national policy, national corridor acts, national connectivity policies to enable people who are on this call, like Milind, to do more effective work wherever they are. I think that is, people are thinking bigger and more ambitious about conservation. And I feel, and to my colleagues in India, I feel India is absent from this conversation. I feel China is leading on what it's called eco-civilization. It's very involved in the current negotiations for the Convention of Biological Diversity, where this 30 by 30 idea is coming. France is very involved, a lot of European nations. India recently hosted the Convention of Migratory Species Next Strategic Plan. It had very powerful statements. It seemed like India was going to lead on connectivity on this issue, and there's been nothing really since what happened in Gujarat. So we really need India to step back as a global leader on this and be part of this high ambition coalition conversation. And if I can, just because this is my moment, just to summarize, if I could, Dipankar, just a couple things, is that the people who are on this call are very bright, committed, inspiring conservation and science leaders. If there's hope in India, is that you have some amazing people, beginning with the other panelists on this call, who are doing great work. And if it wasn't for the kind introductions that many Indians have given me to get to know these folks, I would not know. And so we have to make sure that the world knows how amazing, India is and some of the conservationists are. So that's number one. And as I leave you here in my final few comments, is that for tigers to survive, we have to survive. So, I mean, it is, and we have to survive doing better things for tigers and for the planet. So we want connectivity. We don't want cages. And we really want to create a world that's hopeful and that we can pass on, that's better for the next generation. And I really thank you all for including me and being part of this conversation for tigers and for us.
Thank you so much, Gary. You have given the title for one of the sessions, Connectivity, Not Cages. My role comes to an end here. Thanks to all the panelists for taking out time on a Saturday evening. Uma, Divya, Milind, and Gary, and thanks to all the listeners, audience on Zoom, audience on YouTube, and the backend support team, all the scientists from different organizations. Thank you so much. over to you, Pranav, or anyone from the host, if you'd like to announce the next one or say something. Thank you.
Just to reiterate your thanks to Pankaj, appreciative of the time of our excellent panelists who led us through this amazing journey. And there were moments of despair, but I think really the hope came through. There's immense possibility. There's possibility in collaboration. There's possibility in trying to work sort of collaboratively to conserve tigers and other species across large landscapes. And I think on this note, I just want to tell our audience that this was session 2 of a series of panels. We have several more coming up. And I think, even as today's panel answered some questions for us, it raised many others. There's questions about, how does one effectively conserve tigers across large landscapes that don't only include forests, but other diverse land use types, agriculture, river systems, even little, human settlements and so on, inclusive of communities and all the complexities there. So stay with us through the sessions that lie ahead, because we hope to cover ground on some of these complex issues. The next session is likely on the poaching of tigers and herbivores in other landscapes and the impact it's having on populations and measures that may be taken to sort of contain this and try and reverse the problem. And moving forward, we'd also be looking closely at the place of communities in tiger landscapes and means of integrating conservation models that are inclusive in every respect. So on that note, we'd like to end today with a word of thanks again for the team that's put this together. And if some of you, Aditi, Radha, Dev, if you're here, Abhishek, Vidya, if you can turn your cameras on and wait for a moment, you've been immensely sort of supportive and have been driving this. So thanks a lot. And thank you all again for joining us, and look out for information on the next panel in about a month's time on the fora that you've been receiving information about this series on. Thank you all. Have a good evening or a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Priya.